In 1960, I joined the Star Fellowship, an organisation formed by Tony Wedd of Chiddingstone, which held that contacts with extraterrestrials were the way forward, rather than collecting UFO sightings. It held a rally each year at Tony's home on the Saturday after Whitsun, and he planned a travelling exhibition on flying saucers. The organisation closed when Tony emigrated to Australia, however, but I attempted to restart it in the 1980s and began the magazine Amskaya, which means a star in a claimed extraterrestrial language. The attempt failed except for the magazine, which is still running with a small but loyal subscriber base, which reported many extraterrestrial encounters over the years. Back numbers can be viewed on the Archive for the Unexplained website. See the description of this video for the link. The exhibition never happened, but there is a video on this channel, The Exhibition That Never Was.
I'll tell you what the Star Fellowship is and what it's about. It was founded by Philip Rogers and myself 8 years ago, I think. The idea being to collect funds from an exhibition, but we were fairly agreed that it would need to be a very impressive exhibition to carry anywhere with anybody, a sort of really carefully staged affair that would run into 4 figures rather than 3. On tour, so that as you went round country villages, people would come forward and say, well, it's awfully nice to see a show like this, because I saw something last week, and we thought that if we really got this show on the road, we would bring in a tremendous wealth of even contact stories, as well as a lot of sightings that people ordinarily shut up about. We are a long way short of this ambition, I'm afraid, and our own hopes have rather faded of ever putting that exhibition on the road. Among other troubles, I found people extremely reluctant to part with negatives or help in any way with prints of pictures. Dr. Derbyshire's letter to me said that he had lent Stephen's negative to a well-known researcher whose name I shall not deign to mention, and he couldn't get it back. And I spoke to that researcher too, and I said, can I use it to take some prints? And I got absolutely blank refusal. And I'm afraid this makes an exhibition a rather difficult project. However, we keep hoping.
Issue 11, July 1986, from American National Enquirer during the 1970s. For 20 years, Larry White was afraid of ridicule. So for 20 years, Larry kept secret his encounter with men from outer space. Now, however, with more and more responsible citizens reporting contact with extraterrestrial beings, including an Argentinian whose experiences were reported in midnight, Larry White has decided to talk. Why 20 years of silence? Well, people are funny about these things, said White. They think you may be a little daffy. The 54-year-old furniture maker from Miami, Florida, was born near Binghamton, New York, in the little town of Nichols. It was early in the morning, back in October 1954, when Larry White walked across the Ely golf course at Binghamton. He was on the way to gather mushrooms from the farmlands just beyond. I walked up a small hill, and there they were, he said. They had landed. The spaceship was round like a saucer, and 2 men stood by it. They looked just like you and me, dressed in suits similar to our snowsuits of metallic grey. Their home, they told me, is called Bugratan. It's in the galaxy of Alpha Centauri. It took them 3 Earth years to get here, and they mentioned the atomic bomb. In the March 25th edition of Midnight, Dionisio Yanca of Bahia Blanca, Argentina, stated, "The aliens have been interested in Earth since 5 years after the explosion of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima. They were reported to be observing conditions on Earth, testing to see if survival would be possible for them. They will take nothing from us by conquest," said White. "Only if Earthmen start an atomic war they will stop it and take over. According to White, the aliens want only to study our agriculture. Their people have left the art of living off the land and lost it, he said. They need natural food. Although White was unaware of the Argentinians' encounter with alien beings, his reference to the Bugratans' need for new food strikes another echo. The aliens were able to speak to White in English that had a foreign accent. According to him, they learned to speak the language by means of computerized analysis of the basic sounds of English, formed into a type of universal graph or code. Their spacecraft are powered by an electromagnetic turbine, which takes its power from the elements around it, said White. It needs no fuel. Around the outside of the ship was a strange-looking glass-like tube or ring. Inside the tube a spiral coil contracted and expanded and spiraled around and around. It was very hot. White didn't go aboard the spacecraft. He didn't want to. They asked me if I would like to visit their world, but I was afraid they might use me for a guinea pig in laboratory tests, so I didn't get to see the inside of the ship. But I stood within 3 feet of it, he said. The aliens took their sample of grass and left. The next afternoon there were at least 4 or 5 policemen examining a burned circle of earth, about 4 feet wide and 14 feet in diameter. The earth was burned until the soil had to be removed and replaced, said White. A local newspaper carried the story of the strange burned circle on the Ely golf course, but of Larry White's tale no word was mentioned. Larry kept his secret until now. Issue 5, January 1987. Jonathan Swift's Flying Saucer. In an article in a previous Amskaya, Tony Wedd mentions the mysterious description of the moons of Mars by Jonathan Swift in his book Gulliver's Travels, written before the moons were discovered telescopically. But there is another rather interesting aspect to this. It's that the astronomers who, in the story, found the satellites were seated in a flying saucer. It's not called by that name, of course. The description is of a flying island called Laputa, from which the king rules the island in the sea below. But unlike the natural one, which is irregular as one would expect, the flying island is perfectly circular, though immense, 7,837 yards in diameter. At the centre is a chasm of 50 yards diameter, from which the astronomers descend into a large dome. Inside this, and evidently the nerve centre of the ship, is a large lodestone shaped like a weaver's shuttle. This magnet is 6 yards long and 3 yards wide at its thickest part, and is mounted on what seems to be a kind of inside-out alt-azimuth mounting, so that it can be swivelled in any direction. This controls the motion of the island horizontally or vertically. The saucer is not in the story a spacecraft, for its altitude is limited as its range. It cannot wander more than a certain distance from the island below it. But this is not the important thing. What is remarkable is, once again, the chronoclasm. Jonathan Swift has not only beaten us to it in finding the moons of Mars, he's also presented us with technology we've not even now achieved, but which we see in the flying saucers. The saucer is in stark contrast to most of the other anecdotes from A Voyage to Laputa, which are clearly nonsense writing of the kind later produced by Lewis Carroll, with political overtones. They don't ring true, and they're clearly not meant to. The saucer, however, is precisely described, even to its measurements, and its operation is logical, even if not to us feasible. Controlled by a central magnet reminds us very much of the description of saucers by George Adamski and other contactees. Issue 12, October 1988. Solomon's Spaceship. Erich von Daniken records in his book The Stones of Kiribati, the Kebra Nagast is the oldest Ethiopian traditional scripture. In chapters 30, 52, 58, 59 and 94, it tells at length about a heavenly car which King Solomon inherited from his forefathers and used zealously. But the king and all those who obeyed his word flew on the wagon without pain or suffering, and without sweat or exhaustion, and travelled in one day a distance which usually took 3 months to traverse. If the king had been in the air only 12 of the 24 hours, his craft would have had a speed of 150 kilometers per hour. If we assume that he flew only 8 hours a day, his heavenly car would have had an average speed of 225 kilometers per hour. Not the speed of jet planes, but fast enough to go back and forth between Jerusalem and Srinagar several times a month. Supposing King Solomon had made an interim landing about halfway between Kashmir and Israel, there would presumably be indications of such a landing in present-day Iran. In fact, the Sugarloaf Mountain Takht-e-Suleiman, Throne of Solomon, like the one near Srinagar, is located in northwest Iran at a height of 2,200 meters. Quite apart from any bold flights of the imagination, the fact remains that there are two mountains called after Solomon, one in Iran and one near Srinagar. There were temples consecrated to Solomon on both of them. The edifice in Iran no longer exists, but the temple near Srinagar is still in use. Takht-e-Suleiman near Srinagar. Von Daniken and other writers have noticed the similarity in language and traditions between Kashmir and Israel, with legends such as Moses being buried there, his supposed tomb is still there. Perhaps more contentious is the claimed tomb of Jesus near Srinagar, and of his mother Mary not far away. In going into this, though he does not make any direct connection with extraterrestrials, just with a possible Jewish settlement in Kashmir known to the Essenes, he shares a core story with two other books, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail by Bagent, Lee and Lincoln, and Jesus Lived in India by Kirsten. The story is this, that Jesus did not die on the cross, but was rescued by the Essenes, using a death-feigning drug, which was the vinegar mentioned in the Bible. After this, the body was removed to the tomb and given medical treatment. After this, he travelled to the Jewish colony at Kashmir, living to an old age, and was buried near Srinagar. Strangely enough, the tomb is venerated by local Christians. It would be interesting to know what their doctrine is. There is no point in going into the evidence here, but there is a lot of it, and it's set out particularly well in Kirsten's book. The three books mentioned enlarge on the core story in different ways. The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail goes into the possibility of Jesus being married to Mary Magdalene and producing a bloodline which comes down to the present day. Jesus Lived in India explores the possibility of Buddhist influence on Jesus. Von Daniken simply prints the core story as an adjunct to the Solomon flying ship account. Solomon was, of course, an ancestor of Jesus, according to the genealogy given in the New Testament. Issue 13, January 1989. The Philip Rogers Story. At the Northern Earth Mysteries Moot in Chesterfield in 1988, Philip Heselton gave a review of the life of Philip Rogers of Grindleford. He had very weak sight, which deteriorated to blindness, but this was counteracted by acute hearing and perfect pitch. He was an expert musician and recorder player, performing on Irish and Dutch radio, and was a music teacher. It is, however, for his mysterious tape recordings that he is best known. He picked up a series of sounds and voices that he thought were from space people, and interpreted them in that context. He was born in 1916 of musical parents, his mother an early radio singer, and his father a choirmaster in Sheffield. He was a kind person who perhaps trusted people too much. When young, he was sent to a Swiss Rudolf Steiner clinic for his poor sight, and his interest in anthroposophy remained. During the war, he ran musical appreciation classes for the troops, and the composer Malcolm Arnold wrote a piece dedicated to him. In 1956, he read Inside the Spaceships by George Adamski, and was determined to find the truth of it. 2 weeks after finishing it, he had a hunch to climb nearby Sir William Hill. Reaching the 400-foot summit, he saw nothing, but when descending, he saw a pinpoint of light pulsating red, white, blue, which he described as a cosmic ophthalmoscope. It must have been bright, for his sight was too poor to see stars. On the 5th of January 1957 he again had a hunch to climb the hill, felt excitement on the return journey, and saw a light above road level that changed from white to red, then sped off. Various others had seen UFOs in the area at that time. From then on he had many trips up the hill, with sightings, but when he was told his friends, they said, "You're no good as a witness, your sight's too bad." After this, and another display of lights one night, he heard a loud metallic note, changing in intensity, but not pitch. Then after a trip to Holland he heard the singing discs, sweet silvery notes with no Doppler effect. He identified the notes as F sharp and C sharp. Once when alighting from a bus, he was paced by these tones, first coming from one side and then the other, but he saw nothing. On returning home he heard an ecstatic chorus with the air full of noises. These occurrences continued on other nights, even with the occasional melody, and into the heart of Sheffield, but his friends said, "You're no good as a witness, your hearing's too good." It was not till 24th of November 1957 that he tried to record the noises, with the microphone on the outer windowsill facing east. He heard a loud top C, rewound the tape, and was relieved to find it had recorded a double rising fundamental note with difference tones that no earthly instrument produces. Others have received electronic voice phenomena and suggested an origin in the spirit world, but Philip felt his voices were from space. He made several hundred recordings, some very faint but others quite clear. He used a moving coil microphone set on an east-facing windowsill, with both sashes open. Each tape had the date and time of recording on it. He usually used the 24-hour clock, but once forgot and a voice corrected him. Another indicated that the people were listening to music from the radio, and there was silence during the broadcast, then a babble of voices. The term space was often used. The recordings would only come if Philip was in the building and awake. He had a visit from Alan Wicker of the Tonight programme and was on TV in 1958. The engineers tried an experiment with their equipment and found that when their microphones were near Philip's, it picked up the voices, but when far away it did not. Philip suggested a narrow beam might be involved. From 1960 onwards, the recordings died out. In conclusion, the recordings included sounds, music and human voices. No actual new information seemed to be given, but the people seemed warm and friendly. The BBC Foreign Language Centre at Caversham could not identify the language. The music was all unknown to Philip. The other aspect of his life did in fact yield information, however, thought communication. Through it he built a Unexplained device with many different parts, crystals, etc., a great feat for a nearly blind man. It was the size of an orange with a thumb piece. It was for communication, but he also noticed that it was warm to hold and sometimes flipped itself over. He built a variation for warming the body, which also had healing effects, and even one which was a model flying saucer, which seemed to produce a whirlwind when activated. Tony Wedd and Philip wanted to market the Ross Winger healing device as Wenceslas boots, but this didn't happen. But the thought communication was received that the energy was identical to that known as prana, ki and orgone, and that shape, number, proportion and aesthetic beauty were important. Towards the end of his life he claimed personal contact with space people, and the speaker had in fact met two of the individuals with him. He was not sure what to make of this, but feels sure that if a hoax was perpetrated, it was not by Philip. He was an honest, open character, may possibly have been fooled. He was the chairman of the Star Fellowship. Fuller details of the Philip Rogers story are on my video Voices from Space on this channel. Issue 17, January 1990. From The Guardian, 10th of October 1989. Scientists in the Russian city of Voronezh say they have evidence to back up eyewitness reports that an unidentified flying object recently landed in a park there. According to a news agency, TASS, local people saw a large shining disc hover over the park and land. A hatch opened and out came 1, 2 or 3 creatures similar to humans and also a small robot. The aliens were 3 or even 4 meters, 10 to 13 feet tall, but with very small heads. The news agency quoted witnesses as saying, "They walked around and then went inside again. Eyewitnesses were terrified for several days," TASS said. Mr. Geranych Silanov, head of the Voronezh Geophysical Laboratory, told TASS he and his team have identified the exact spot. "We detected a circle 20 meters in diameter plus 4 dents of about 4 to 5 centimeters in depth. We also found 2 mysterious pieces of rock. At first glance they looked like sandstone of a deep red colour. However, mineralogical analysis has shown that the substance cannot be found on Earth. But additional tests are needed to reach more definite conclusion," he said. The scientific findings of where the UFO landed matched witnesses' accounts, he said. From the same issue, strange confirmation for Adamski. A bizarre story, which nonetheless seems to support Adamski's claims, was recently published in Folklore Frontiers in an article entitled Green Monsters by Nigel Watson. It apparently occurred in December 1931 and is on the surface a purely religious experience, possibly with out-of-the-body connotations, but based on traditional Christian imagery. Yet the description of the craft in the story is strikingly similar to one Adamski described 20 years later. Charlie Woodward had a dream or vision after a day of praying. He climbed one mountain, then he climbed a cottonwood tree on the summit of an even higher mountain. A voice called him down, and as he approached the earth he spotted 2 men. One was an extra large man, the other not quite as large. It was God and Jesus. Traditional Christian imagery. Yet the description of the craft in the story is strikingly similar to one Adamski described 20 years later. They were in what they called a pilot. It was a round room about 10 feet high, 8 feet across, with a screen all around and a post in the centre of the room. The room had seats with backs to the centre post. They invited me to get into the pilot. As he got into the craft, he saw his body lying on the ground near the cottonwood tree. They flew to heaven, which he was told was 700 miles above the earth. This took 3 minutes to reach. Heaven contained lakes and meadows and streets paved with gold. The craft described has many details later mentioned by Adamski in his contact claims. Particularly prominent are the central column, the round room, the screen round the walls, and the seats with the backs to the column. It is an amazing correlation, especially as such craft would probably not figure in the science fiction of the time, as they did 20 years later. Or did Adamski take Charlie Woodward's account as his model? It seems rather unlikely that he would have known of it. Having said this, the Orthodox Christian imagery is interesting. It almost seems that a real happening occurred, but the powerful cognitive webs of the contactee's religious beliefs distorted his perception and his memory of the event. Cognitive dissonance is one of the darkest sides of the human emotional system, being the source of the concept of heresy, which has caused vast numbers of horrifying atrocities. Issue 19, July 1990. George Van Tassel. George Van Tassel was an American contactee who lived at Giant Rock Airport, Yucca Valley, California. The rock after which the airport was named was indeed large, a huge natural boulder which had had a room carved into its base and which, according to Van Tassel, was very powerful and an aid to mental communication. The following is an account of a broadcast Van Tassel made on American TV, a program called Contact, during the 1960s, and of which an American friend sent me a tape. In this program, George Van Tassel and Lawrence Blasey of the Cleveland UFO Society were interviewed by Harvey, surname not given. He was introduced as George Van Tassel of Giant Rock Airport, Yucca Valley, California, author of The Council of the Seven Lights. During the course of the program, Mr. Van Tassel gave an account of his first contact. It was his custom, and that of many in the area, to take their bed outside to sleep, for it was far too hot inside, and they did not have air conditioning. One night he was awoken by a man standing at the foot of his bed. This was not unusual, as he was 15 miles from the nearest other house, and people with car trouble often stopped there. But this man introduced himself as Solvanen, or a similar name, the tape was rather blurred here, and invited him aboard a craft that was standing nearby. He did not see it land or on this or subsequent contacts. He was unable to wake his wife, which he had thought unusual, as she was usually a light sleeper, but accepted the invitation and found himself inside a cabin which looked similar to the one in the film The Day the Earth Stood Still, except that this had a column in the centre from the floor to the ceiling. He was shown instruments which emerged from the walls, and chairs which came out of the floor, and a wardrobe containing the people's clothes. There were 3 others aboard the ship. Then he was taken down through a manhole in the floor to see the working of the ship. He saw 2 rotors turning in opposite directions, and was told this was a magnetic motor. He likened it to Ezekiel's description of wheels within wheels in the Bible. His guide, who was wearing a grey-blue roll-necked sweatshirt-type garment and ski trousers, responded to questions in his mind before he spoke them. After the contact, the man returned with him to his bed, then went back to the craft, which took off and was gone within 7 seconds. He mentioned another occasion on which he had seen a saucer over Giant Rock Airport, but another man had been pinned to the ground by a force field and so didn't see it, though he heard it. He couldn't move until it had gone. In answer to a question as to whether saucers come from another time zone, he said no. He was sure they came from other planets in this solar system, as they were familiar with us and our ways, and have been for thousands of years. Lawrence Blasey said that he was sure there was a way station on the moon, used for close observation of Earth, from telescopic evidence and communication with saucer people. When asked about electricity blackouts, Mr. Van Tassel said he thought they were caused by the force field of craft if they came close to power lines. He implied this was not deliberate. Later, when asked by the interviewer in a rather aggressive way to give evidence of his claims, he said he had, from contacts with space people, known that the buzzing of Washington in 1952 would occur, and had in fact told the officials there, but had been ignored. Issue 32, April 1994. The Wonderful Ride of Dan Fry by Tony Wedd. One of the principal sites for rocket testing in 1952 was White Sands, New Mexico. Here a man might think that pushing on 5,000 miles an hour was still terrific. Dan Fry, one of the Aerojet group, was designing instruments to monitor a speed like that, but in the middle of that year he was not only given a ride across the USA at 8,000 miles an hour, but was also given a simple explanation of how these ships can manage fantastic acceleration without damage to the occupants. A force like that of gravity is applied to every particle of the ship and occupants, so that they all contribute to the thrust, so no acceleration pressure is felt. He'd missed the bus, literally, and found that he was almost alone in a deserted camp. Everyone had gone to town to celebrate the 4th of July. His room seemed hot and stuffy, the more so as he was trying to read Heat Transfer by James Cork. So he took a walk towards the old V2 static test stand, a mile and a half from camp, but an impulse turned off along a side track into the mountains. The sky was cloudless and the stars were bright. No reason then why a bright star should go out. As he watched, another one was gone, then two more. Evidently a large dark object was approaching him in complete silence, and he might have run from it if he'd known which way. It turned out to be a 30-foot wide oblate spheroid, of the same colour as the night sky. 70 feet away from him it quietly settled down. The ship's operation was silent. The Soviets might be ahead, but not that far ahead. It could only be an extraterrestrial craft, and by no means lighter than air. Dan Fry was eventually invited aboard, the ship being under remote control. The space people were still several years off being able to breathe our atmosphere or subject themselves to twice the gravity they were used to. So the contact had to be remotely controlled and conducted. He was taken on a trip over New York, which looked incredibly beautiful from 20 miles up, with all the lights a-twinkle. After half an hour he was back again, being allowed a free fall as the ship he was in was not equipped with zero-gravity compensation. So he came to see, woven into the fabric behind his seat, the symbol of a caduceus. It gave him quite a shock. But this link-up with the world's cultural history might be relevant to what he had already been told, that these people were survivors of an Earth cataclysm who had escaped to Mars when it was more habitable than today. There had been a war between Mu and Atlantis, which left the Earth uninhabitable for a while, and caused the continents to shift. In his third contact in 1954, Dan Fry was told that our technology is on a lateral branch of a tree of the universal science. At some point we introduced a limitation which set us out on a limb. Thus we have to elaborate and complicate our maths in order to adjust them to the facts, but this bars our way to understanding other branches of the science. Issue 33, July 1994. From Pegasus, Journal of the Surrey Investigation Group on Aerial Phenomena. Farnham Man healed by aliens. For 10 years, Tom Fraser wondered about his strange experience, but only recently decided to tell Bufora investigators his story. Now aged 27, Tom set it down as he remembered it. Between 7:30 and 8:15, on the night of Tuesday, 28th February 1984, I was involved in a road accident near Guildford. A car hit me, and I was thrown off my motorbike. I was unconscious before I hit the ground, but my last clear memory was of a bright light in the sky to my right. There were low clouds and a light drizzle of rain, and the sky totally overcast, so that neither stars nor aircraft lights could have been seen. There was no moon, as the new moon would not have occurred until the 2nd of March. As I came to, I could see a bright light about me, and as my eyes focused, I saw 3 beings looking at me. The first thing I remember about them is their oversized hairless heads. They were quite pale complexioned, with a sort of off-white, light grey pigmentation. Their eyes, though quite similar to human eyes, were tilted up slightly. The pupils were diamond-shaped and at about a 45-degree angle. They were about 4 to 4.5 feet in height. I was lying on a sort of bed, and I could see another to the left of me and in the room. There was a body in it, motionless and apparently unconscious, but the strange thing is it looked remarkably like myself. I have the impression that there were only 2 of these beds in the room. There was a raised control panel in the centre of the room, and someone standing at this could look at both the beds. The beings were standing behind this control console, and one appeared to be operating it, with the 2 others standing behind him. I have the impression of a leader-helpers situation in this room. I could hear words saying that they were going to heal me, and that I should not worry, but their mouths were not moving. I now believe that these beings were communicating telepathically. I could sense no malice or hostility from them, and felt they only wanted to help me. I laid my head back and fell asleep. When I awoke, I was told that my injuries had been extensive, but they had been able to cure them. They also said I was lucky that they had been observing the area, and that they were able to help me. I was told I would feel tired for a while and that I should rest. Then I fell asleep again. When I reawakened, I saw that the other body, I am now convinced this person was dead, had been removed, and I saw no other humans aboard the craft. I found myself dressed in some clothing similar to that of the beings themselves. It had a metallic sheen to it, and was greyish in colour. There were no buttons or zips. Perhaps it was some sort of velcro seams. The corridors had no form of lighting such as we would use, for the walls and ceilings emitted light, and there were no shadows. I also have impression of another room with a control bridge, circular, with 1 or 2 entrances. One being was working at a raised panel, while 2 others operated some controls. There was a display panel on one wall. I also have vague memories of what I think was some sort of maintenance or docking bay, a large area with 2 or 3 craft in it. At no time do my memories indicate any hostile act, maltreatment, or any intention of acting harmfully towards me. One very strong impression I retain is of the leader asking for my help in something. I agreed to help, but do not know what I agreed to. One of them said they would have to break my arm, as it would look too strange if I walked away with no injuries after being hit head-on by a car and thrown off my motorbike into some trees. I agreed to all this. I was taken to Epsom District Hospital directly from the accident site and was asked if I'd been unconscious. I said I had not, and can remember a feeling of panic. I'm not sure why I felt this, at the suggestion of a head x-ray. My injuries were a severe fracture of the upper third of the right humerus, nerve damage and loss of most of my right elbow due to severe infection. I regained full consciousness in a private room about 5 or 6 hours after the crash, when my parents came to pick me up, and I discharged myself, for though I could not walk, I felt well enough to travel. Staff were puzzled that I only had a broken arm, as my motorbike was very severely damaged. I believe I should have died in that accident, but for some unknown reason I did not. The witness had an idea that hypnosis would help him to recover more detailed memories of his experience, but he was advised against it. Issue 39, January 1997. 2 early contacts. Looking through some items in my attic recently, I came across some notes for a talk I gave many years ago. In them I mentioned 2 sightings involving occupants of craft. I do not seem to have recorded the sources. In 1909, Mr. C. Lethbridge, dock worker and Punch and Judy purveyor, was pushing his Punch and Judy cart home via Caerphilly Mountain on Tuesday the 16th of May, when he found a cylindrical construction beside the road. Inside were 2 young men dressed in heavy fur coats and hats. On seeing him, the men jumped up and jabbered furiously at each other in a strange language. Then the machine rose into the air in a zigzag fashion, leaving a depression in the grass. In this clipping from the Evening Express on the 19th of May 1909, Lethbridge points up in the direction the craft disappeared. The label found close to the spot was the source of much press speculation, as in the 21st of May edition. On the 23rd of July 1947, less than a month after Kenneth Arnold's sighting, Jose Higgins, a topographer in Brazil, saw a circular object land. His companions ran, but he stayed, and 2 people about 7 feet tall emerged from the craft and spoke in an unknown language. They communicated by signs, Higgins drawing several circles to represent orbits of planets, as Adamski was later to do, and they pointed to the 7th, which he considered meant Uranus, but could have been the 7th planet of another solar system. Looking at the evidence from Daniel Ross's book, UFOs and the Complete Evidence from Space, however, it would seem more than possible that it could have been Uranus that was meant. Issue 38, July 1996. A Revealing Contact. Beyond Top Secret by Timothy Good, Sidgwick and Jackson, is an updated edition of Above Top Secret and contains much new information since the original was published in 1987. One of the most revealing cases about the attitudes and activities of officialdom, and also one that will particularly interest us, is the contact by Sid Padrick in California on January the 30th, 1965. 45-year-old Sid Padrick, a TV and radio technician, as well as a private pilot with 600 flying hours experience, served in the Air Force during the Second World War, and at the time of the incident was serving in the Air Force Reserve. At 2 o'clock on 30th of January 1965, as he was taking a customary late-night walk, Patrick claimed to have encountered a landed UFO near his home at Manrizo Beach. He was taking a late-night walk at Manrizo Beach when he encountered a landed UFO, was invited on board, and had a long and interesting contact with beings who seemed benign and advanced and didn't seem at all threatening. Not so the Air Force investigators, whose representatives told him the craft were real hostile and that he had no business even approaching them. One instruction from the investigators was very revealing as to the motives behind harassment of contactees. He was asked not to reveal that the visitors said they had no money. He was also told not to disclose the size and shape of the craft because that would indicate the Air Force was not doing its job. He saw the shadowy outline of an unlit craft some 75 feet in diameter and 30 feet high, like two real thick saucers inverted, approach him and come to rest just above the ground. He panicked, began to run, then heard a voice coming from the craft. "Do not be frightened, we are not hostile," it said. Patrick ran further. The voice repeated the phrase and added, "We mean you no harm," and invited him on board. As he cautiously approached the craft, a door opened and he went inside, finding himself in a small compartment about 6 by 7 feet. Another door slid open and he entered, to be met by a man. He was no different than me in basic appearance, had clean-cut features and wore a type of flying suit that covered the body fully, said Patrick. On board were another 7 men, similar in appearance, and 1 woman, described as extremely pretty. They were all about 5 feet 8 inches to 5 feet 9 inches tall. By our own standards, I would say they all looked between 20 and 25 years old. Very young, pert, energetic and intelligent looking. Their features were similar to ours. There was only one feature I noticed that would differ from us greatly, and that was that their faces came to a point much more than ours. They had sharp chins and noses. Their skin was somewhat of an Armenian colour. Their eyes were all dark. There was nothing unusual about them, their brightness, depth or luminescence. All the men appeared to have very short auburn hair, and it looked as though it had never been cut. It looked like a natural growth. The lady had long hair and it was pushed down inside her clothing. Their fingers were a little longer than mine. The hands were very clean. The fingernails looked as if someone had just given them a manicure. The first man Patrick saw acted as spokesman, explaining that he was the only one on board who spoke English. He had no accent whatsoever. It was just as plain and just as perfectly spoken English as anyone had ever spoken on this earth. I believe they can adapt themselves to whatever condition they're working under. Every question I asked him, he would pause for about 25 or 30 seconds before he would answer, regardless of how minor it was. Perhaps he was getting instructions mentally, in what response to give. I think the crew communicated with each other. It was through mental telepathy, because I could see nothing that would indicate communication otherwise. Each of the rooms that was occupied had instrument panels on the walls, with the crew members concentrating on the instruments. They merely glanced around at me when I entered the room, then turned back to their work as if they were unconcerned. Patrick was shown an oblong lens which he took to be part of a viewing system, with a magnified 3-dimensional effect. On it he saw an object which he was told was a navigation craft that looked like a blimp. This was at 2:45 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and the object was in sunlight, so it had to be pretty far out. I imagine 1,000 miles out or better. I didn't see any markings or portholes on it. After a while, the spaceman told Patrick they'd travelled some distance and were now parked in a deserted area, which on subsequent investigation turned out to be near Leggett, California, 175 miles northwest of Watsonville. After we landed on the hillside, he told me to step out so that I could come back to the place later, to know this was real and not dreamed. I stepped out alone and walked around the outside of the ship, I felt the hull. It seemed very hard but not metallic. I never felt anything like it before. The closest thing to it I ever felt on this earth would be a windshield, plexiglass. Patrick asked where the craft and its people had come from, and received a somewhat cryptic reply. He told me they were from a planet in the back of a planet which we observe, but we do not observe them. He didn't say we couldn't observe them, he merely said we didn't observe them. I think their planet is in our solar system. Patrick was shown a photo of a city on the visitor's planet. Every building in that picture was rounded off, half-moon shaped. I saw windows on the buildings. I cannot say the picture looked like anything I've ever seen before, because the buildings were spaced differently, offset from each other. It looked like they'd put one about 50 feet from another and the next one 150 feet. There appeared to be roads in the distance, and there was foliage in the foreground, trees and bush too. The spaceman described his utopian society to Patrick. As you know it, we have no sickness, we have no crimes, we have no police force, we have no schools. Our young are taught at an early age to do a job which they do very well. Because of our long life expectancy, we have a very strict birth control. We have no money, we live as one. Patrick asked what the purpose of the visit was. The man replied, observation only. Patrick explained, I don't think it's meant for them to observe us. I think it was for me to observe them, because he didn't ask me at any time my name, my age, how many teeth I had, how many members of my family. He didn't ask me one thing about myself, and this leads me to believe that they know about us already, and he came for us to observe them. They did say they would come for further observations. I think they're observing people mostly. There was no mention of earthquakes, fault lines, or anything government-wise or political-wise, or anything that would affect our future, except that they gave me the impression they will pick up more people. Sid Patrick was taken into what was referred to by the visitors as a consultation room. The colour effect in this room defied description. Would you like to pay your respects to the Supreme Deity? He was asked. When he said that, I almost fainted. I didn't even know how to accept it. I said to him, we have one, but we call it God. Are we talking about the same thing? He replied, there is only one. So I knelt and did my usual prayer. Until that night, I've never felt the presence of the Supreme Being, but I did feel him that night. It's obvious that they are on a very high scientific level, but their relation with the Supreme Being means a lot more to them than their technical and scientific ability and knowledge. I would say that their religion and their science are all one. Patrick was taken back to where he had been picked up 2 hours earlier, then stepped out of the craft and walked home. Issue 43, October 1998. Timothy Good's Personal Encounters. From Alien Base by Timothy Good. Published by Century. The closest I came to meeting George Adamski was in November 1963, during my first tour of the United States with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. Because Los Angeles was on the itinerary, I was determined to take a bus to his home in Vista. In the event, the bus schedule didn't coincide with mine, and I had to abandon the idea. Yet a curious incident occurred en route to Los Angeles, which left a deep and lasting impression on me. On the 13th of November, we left Tucson, Arizona, for the 500-mile ride to Los Angeles, in a convoy of 3 buses. About halfway there, near the Arizona-California border, we stopped at a roadside restaurant. Sitting at a table with some colleagues, casually surveying the customers waiting in line, my attention was drawn to an extraordinary-looking girl with blonde, bobbed hair, delicate, pale features, and a petite figure. Later I was reminded of Adamski's description of Kalna and her almost transparent skin. Adamski was the first to proclaim that some people from other planets were actually living and working among us, illegal aliens as it were, and stated that his contacts often took place in the anonymous surroundings of restaurants and hotel lobbies. Having spoken with a number of other witnesses who had related similar encounters, I decided to make an attempt at telepathic communication with this unknown girl, and transmitted the question, "Are you from another planet?" There was no immediate response, but she left the queue and made a point of walking past my table, pausing to give me a gracious smile and an actual bow of acknowledgement before proceeding to another part of the restaurant with a deadpan expression on her face. Although I can't remember the precise location of the restaurant, I do recall that one of the highway signs nearby indicated Desert Centre, by coincidence not far from the site of Adamski's initial encounter. 4 years later I had another such experience while in the United States. In February 1967 I was in New York City for a series of concerts with the London Symphony Orchestra in the Carnegie Hall. One afternoon I decided, as an experiment, to attempt some further telepathic communication in the lobby of the Park Sheraton Hotel, now the Omni Park Central, at 56th Street on 7th Avenue, where we were staying. I'd just returned from my first meeting with Madeline Roddifer in Washington, D.C. Madeline had told me that she had encounters with the space people, and that these most often took place in public places. I resolved to try and settle the matter once and for all. Settling back on a sofa in the lobby, I transmitted a telepathic request, which went something like this: "If any of you people from elsewhere are in New York vicinity, please come and sit down right next to me and prove it." New York is, of course, a busy city, and a hotel lobby seems the most incongruous of venues to conduct such an experiment. Many people, a few of them strange if terrestrial, came and went during the ensuing half hour or so. Suddenly a man entered the lobby whose demeanour put me on alert. Dressed in a charcoal grey suit with a white shirt and dark tie, he could have passed for a businessman from Madison Avenue. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall, with curly fair hair, a tanned complexion and perfectly proportioned features, and he appeared to me to be about 35 years of age. He came and sat down beside me. From an attaché case he took out a copy of the New York Times. Unfolding this, he began to turn the pages over in a rather deliberate and superficial manner. After he'd refolded the paper, I felt the time had come to ask him telepathically if he really was from another planet, and if so, would he please identify himself by placing his right index finger on the right side of his nose. The response was immediate and dramatic, for no sooner had I transmitted the thought than he did precisely that. Sitting dumbfounded, I wondered what on earth the next move would be. I attempted more telepathy, but nothing else happened. Perhaps I should have engaged him in conversation, but being British, clearly a drawback to interplanetary communications, I had reservations about such an approach. Also, I felt that if my expectations were well founded, it should be he and not I who should initiate any such conversation. We both sat silently for a few minutes. Then he stood up, walked over to some display windows behind and to my right, about 15 feet away. Observing him surreptitiously, I noticed that he appeared to be taking little interest in the merchandise displayed there, and after a few more minutes he gave me a long, penetrating look, then turned and walked out into 7th Avenue. I never saw him again. Of course, it can logically be argued that this experience, like the one in 1963, was coincidental. Telepathy often is commonplace, as people who pick up unspoken thoughts of a companion often know. For instance, Dr. Dennis Ross, a physicist at Iowa State University, told me that he and his brother had communicated telepathically with one another until the age of 12. Perhaps then this man in New York was merely a receptive mortal who picked up my thoughts and responded accordingly. I'm the first to accept the plausibility of this hypothesis, yet there was something oddly distinctive about him which I cannot erase. As far as I'm concerned, the experiment was a success. It's not the sort of experiment that would meet with the approval of radio astronomers. I believe that it was intended as a personal proof and encouragement for me. From the same issue, Lou Zinstag, in the book George Adamski, The Untold Story, which she co-authored with Timothy Good, also recounts an interesting encounter. Quite naturally, I asked Adamski in 1959 if there would ever be a chance for me to meet a spaceman. "Of course," he answered, "but I wouldn't know when and where. I can't arrange such an encounter for anybody, not even for myself. It's entirely up to them." "Well, I know that you get distinct telepathic messages or even a summons," I said. "You're particularly gifted, but I have no such talents and therefore no such hopes." "I guess you could get telepathic messages too," he replied. "The main thing is to stay alert at all times, wherever you are." This was too vague for me, and I insisted that he tell me more. His answer was, "The one thing I can say is that spoken verification will never be given. As to receiving telepathically, try to throw your thoughts, if you have a hunch, at the person. Throw your thought with force, like a tennis ball, releasing it instantly. If your hunch is correct, it will strike him, and you will get an answer with a gesture or a smile or a nodding of the head. There are answers which can be given without words, as you know. They are much too cautious to speak up, as I've said many times." At the time, I didn't think this advice was very helpful to one as ungifted as I, but in June 1961 I did have a true contact, and as Adamski had said, no words were involved. For quite a while I kept it to myself, but the circumstances in which it happened were so significant that I immediately wrote it down in some length. Saturday the 24th of June was an extremely hot day. While on Friday before I'd planned to go to the local playhouse to enjoy a Savoyan comedy, I decided that morning that it was much too hot to go out to our old theatre, a building without any air conditioning. I knew from experience that it would be torture to sit for hours in those plush seats. By the time I'd got an early dinner with my father, I'd almost forgotten about the comedy. But suddenly my father mentioned the fact that we hadn't made much use of his theatre ticket bonuses during this season, and that this was a pity. Without thinking, I asked for one and left him. There was just enough time to get to the theatre. Had my father not started talking about it, I would not have considered it again. However, it was still so hot in the street that I changed my mind again and headed towards the river in the hope for some fresh air. But suddenly I reversed my step. To this day I don't know what made me turn around and walk suddenly towards the theatre, but I did. Entering the theatre foyer, I felt relieved, however, to see the sold-out notice hanging above the cashier's desk, and was just about to leave when the cashier gave me a sign asking, "How many?" "Only one," I said, "and only if it's the first row of the balcony." "Well, there it is," he cried out. "It's just been returned." I bought it, of course. These preliminaries became significant when I later recollected how circumstances had driven me into the theatre that evening. In spite of the heat, the theatre was sold out. During the interval, everyone went into the lobby trying to get a drink at the bar, or at least some fresh air by one of the high windows. The 3 large double doors stood wide open, and I found a small table for myself, with an ashtray on it. Looking around and lighting a cigarette, I noticed that everyone was looking exhausted. I wasn't alone in suffering from the extreme heat wave, the first of the year. Suddenly I saw a man entering the door farthest from where I was. He attracted my attention at once because he looked as fresh as a daisy, happy and very healthy. His face had a beautiful tan, and his step was quick and elastic. He had deep blue eyes and high cheekbones. He looked foreign, and I thought that he might be Norwegian or Canadian. His dark blonde hair was brushed back. He wore a white shirt and open collar, unusual for a visitor to the theatre in the early 60s. His jacket was blue and his trousers grey, rather too short for his legs, I noticed. There was something in his gait which struck me as odd, and I saw him meandering through the groups of people standing in his way. But the oddest thing was that from the first moment he had never looked at anyone but me, seeming very friendly and smiling broadly. I thought that he mistook me for somebody else and tried to avoid his eyes, but I simply couldn't. I had to follow his with mine. His smile was now increasing. Every muscle in his face was smiling, and there was a triumphant touch in his expression, as if he wanted to say, Long last I have tracked you down, and here I am." It was so disconcerting that I couldn't help but smile back, which was very unusual for me. Suddenly the word "alerted" came to my mind, probably because he looked so wide awake and happy. And it was this word which made the penny drop, so to speak. Now that he was quite close to my table, not more than 3 meters away, I forcefully threw the thought at him: "Are you or are you not a spaceman?" At that very moment his smile increased, and his eyes sparkled beautifully, as if to say, "At long last she's got it." And he nodded his head emphatically several times, his smile vanishing for a moment. Slowly he turned on his heels like a ballet dancer, while with his arms and hands he made a gesture which emphasized the nodding of his head. He did this 3 times and then quickly left. I sat spellbound for quite a while. A stranger had answered a thought of mine, and what a thought! What a question! Unconsciously I had done what George had told me 2 years before, a thing which I had always considered as being beyond my mental means. I'd thrown a thought like a tennis ball and released it instantly, and it had hit the stranger, and I had got my answer. Just as Adamski said, it was given with a smile, with gestures, and with a nodding of the head. After a few moments I followed him into the corridor, where people were walking up and down. There I saw him again, walking with a simply dressed young woman. Both were looking at her sandal, which seemed to have slipped from her foot, but as soon as I stood in the doorway, very near to them, the man looked up at me, turning from the woman, and this time it was his thought which hit me instantly. No, there would not be any more to it. No handshake, no conversation. So I stood stock still and let them pass. The woman never noticed me. The pair must have left the building before the performance was over. The moment the curtain fell, I took up a position in the corridor, from where I could see everyone leaving the theatre. They were not among the crowd, but even now, after 20 years, I would recognize the man if I ever saw him again. Needless to say, this experience had a decisive impact on my powers of positive thinking, providing me with the mental and emotional energy and the solid steadfastness which I've never lost to this day. Issue 44, July 1999. From UFO Quest by Alan Watts. Why UFOs? The reader may well think that I have jumped the gun when I unequivocally attribute the crop designs to UFOs. The answer is that no theory fits the facts other than that the designs are being drawn by some form of electromagnetic beam controlled from an invisible UFO. It would appear from the available evidence that there may be an intermediate small kind of telemetry disc which occasionally can be seen actually doing the drawing, but it must, one imagines, receive its power down a beam projected from much higher up. However, the UFO is not always invisible. On at least one occasion, a UFO has been caught in the act of making a circle. It was the first report of a circle in England in 1991, and came from Butley in Somerset. A local lad, Dave Harris, was riding his bicycle towards Butley when he heard a high-pitched humming near an avenue of cedar trees which crossed the road. Some 15 feet up, over a field of very early wheat to his left, he saw a silvery bell-shaped craft. It was stationary, and below it a spiralling vortex of aura-like light was making a circle in the crop. Harris was so astounded by what he saw that he rode his bike into the side of the road and fell off onto the grass verge. The craft subsequently flew away at high speed, and apart from the hum, there was, Harris said, just a swishing noise as it departed. The whole thing was over in a few seconds. All this had taken place in broad daylight, around 6 p.m. on Sunday, 14th of April, 1991. Timothy Good, 1992. Harris's description of the light was aura-like, indicates that it was not brightly luminous or clear-cut. Ionized air formed about a beam of strong electromagnetic radiation could produce a diffuse light like an aura. There was also the hum, which we can attribute to the skin waves in the magnetic shell surrounding the UFO, playing on the surrounding air, and so coming to Harris as a hum. Other observations of UFOs in association with circles have occurred. Delgado and Andrews, 1990, report that two pensioners, Pat and Jack Collins, were driving over Stockbridge Down in Hampshire on the evening of 6th July 1985, when they were extremely frightened by the appearance of a huge circular object standing on edge like a Ferris wheel. It was stationary and hovering close to the ground, some 200 yards from them. Yellow-white light surrounded the rim of the object, while other lights formed spokes to the centre. Groups of 5 crop circles were discovered the following morning near Alresford, 12 miles east of Stockbridge, and Goodworth Clatford, miles north of Stockbridge. A similar form of sighting was made near Warminster in August 1982, and again there were crop circles in the vicinity. This form of sighting is very unusual, and it's doubtful if these wheel-like devices were busy making the circles that were afterwards found in the vicinity. However, they might conceivably be mother craft, providing backup for the smaller UFO doing the actual work. Issue 47, October 2000. The Silpho Moore Message. Tony Wedd spoke about the disc in London in 1970. Mr. Dickinson and 2 friends were going up Silpho Moor in a car when it flashed overhead, blazing. The bright light dropped down in the heather, and they were very impressed. Mr. Dickinson went after it and saw it lying on the turf, a bit scared to pick it up, and went back to his car and said, "Well, there it is, a flying saucer." Of course they wanted to go and see it too, and by the time they got to the spot it had gone. So of course Mr. Dickinson had a wretched time of it. A couple Mr. Dickinson himself had seen had picked it up and made off with it, so Dickinson put a notice in the paper saying he'd like to contact anyone who'd picked it up. A chap came in with a sack over his shoulder, plonked it down and said, "10 quid. Wouldn't give his name, but connected his 10 quid and went, and Dickinson got his saucer back. He was convinced it was the same object. It looked the same. It's a shame the way it's been treated, with a hole gouged through the copper. It's a shambles. It appears to have some kind of copper tube inside." Many years later, the bits of the Silpho Moor disc were found in the archive of the Science Museum in London.
I was talking to someone just now about the Silpho Moor disc, which I handled up in Scarborough when I went to see it in the care of the solicitor there, Mr. Dickinson's solicitor. The impressive thing about this is that it's made of such thick copper. And imagine anybody trying to spin 1/8 sheet copper into that sort of shape. It just isn't on unless you have very powerful machinery. And the clincher, so far as I'm concerned, is that years after this had landed, they'd split it open down the screw here, took out the message from inside, and generally written it off. Someone discovered that in fact the copper wasn't a single plain sheet of copper, but an inner and an outer piece, the outer being a rather fine foil, very tightly bonded onto the inner, so tightly that nobody knew for years that there were 2 pieces of copper involved. If you're going to cook up a hoax, why go to the extent of laminating your inner and outer piece together so that no one even knows about it? And I am really convinced that though there are anomalies in this Silpho Moor disc, such as they're saying, no one from space has ever landed on the Earth. This is a tall order. And they may have wanted us to believe that. I don't know. I don't understand that, and I'd rather like to go back to the original translation to make sure that that's what in fact was said. But there are certainly some things about that disc which strike me as absolutely genuine. And it's unfortunate that Mr. Dickinson now won't discuss the subject. He's had his leg pulled so much. And when I was investigating this, the poor Philipstone, whose care it was distraught. He says the scientists go and look at it, they say it's a hoax. The flying saucerologists are rather few and far between, so he can't sell it to them. But if he puts it on show, everybody says, well, of course it's a hoax, you're making money out of it. And so they're setting his attic in a little carton with various bits and pieces, and people come along and they hack a bit off now and again if they want to investigate it. The interesting thing is how it was coded. The people who were sent it claimed to be on another planet and listening to our radio. So they had English, they had a little bit of French because they mentioned hearing the song Chateau André, and they said they rather liked it. They were defraud our mariners generally. In fact, they said their council was against them making any contact with the Earth because we were a lot of baddies here. But they themselves, that is to say, and his secretary Tanji, were rather anarchistically minded. They thought that they thought they would get in touch with us via an obsolete disc that nobody wanted, which they would rig up just for the one-way journey, and arrange to explode on land. And they told us a lot more about themselves and how they suggested we should avoid future wars by setting up a type of United Nations organization that would prevent it. Because we had wars once on our planet long, long ago, but all the same we did used to fight, and this is how we set about eliminating war. What they did to code this English, not having any written script in which to do it, was to make up two punches, an L-shaped punch and a T-shaped punch, and they used these punches in 8 different positions to give a 16-cipher alphabet. And on the outside of the disc, they made a little table up with 1 dot, 2 dots, 3 dots, 4 dots in one column, and funny little L's and T's in the other column, very obviously coding the numeral 1 with 3 symbols, the numeral 2 with only 2 symbols, and so on. So it was very definitely their way of writing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to about 14 or 15. And in that way it was possible to decode the message inside, which was on some very fine copper foil with these little punch symbols. So quite a bit of decoding, and because there were only 16 letters instead of 25, a little bit difficult to be quite sure now and again that they've got it right.
The text of the message on the scroll is on Amskaya 47. All the issues of Amskaya can be viewed on the website of the Archives for the Unexplained in Sweden. The URL link to the Amskaya menu is on the description of this video.